Hello and welcome to the third and final online class for this week, and it will be your last one for the semester. We will be meeting, or a reminder that we will be meeting in class starting Monday the 28th. In our last video, we covered the first half of the first chapter of your textbook, and there was a discussion of some of the ideas that animate American politics, what your book calls the 7 big ideas, and we covered the first 3 of those. This video is going to consider the final 4 as well as some final considerations for how ideas and things of that nature affect American politics. So the first of the big 7 we're going to be talking about in this video is individualism. Now, this is probably the first time that I'm just going to come out and say I think that the book is almost entirely wrong in its presentation of this topic. Now, that isn't to say that I don't think individualism is an important topic in American politics. I just don't really think that the book accurately explains what's going on in the American psyche. The book wants to make a distinction between solidarity and individualism. The idea being individuals think that they should take care of themselves, or at the most, some small group around them, like their family, should take care of them. Whereas solidarity, the idea being that society should come together to take care of people when they need taken care of. This is a totally false choice. There is almost no one, or if they do exist, they're a very, very small number of people who genuinely believe in true individualism, at least in the way that the book talks about it. And that's always been the case. The better way of thinking about it is as opposed to individualism versus solidarity, is non-governmental versus governmental action. Again, the way that your book wants to talk about it is it wants to say that you have people who are individualistic, and they think that people should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, or if they're down on their luck, they can either just take care of themselves, or maybe their friends and family can help them out, or whatever. But again, like I said, that's never really been a real thing. The most individualistic time you can think of, something along the lines of early America and the founding, or in westward expansion, people who expanding out into the Western territories. Those eras would be the times that your book, at least, and rightly so, identifies as perhaps the most individualistic. But they were full of people helping each other. They were full of, in some ways, government helping people. The difference is it wasn't the federal government. It wasn't considered the federal government's responsibility to help people. The general idea was that when someone needed help, for whatever reason, that the group or organization or individuals best suited to help were the ones closest to the problem with the capability to help. So, for instance, if you have an issue, then you should take care of yourself if you can. If you are incapable of taking care of yourself, maybe it's something that you can't, it's too big of a problem for you to fix yourself. Then the first group, the first sort of social group outside of yourself, would be your family and your friends. But maybe, and so they should be the ones who help you. And then, maybe it's too big of a problem for them. Maybe you have had a terrible accident, and you have no living family, and maybe you're new to the area, so you don't have a whole lot of friends either. You've just moved into town, and you have some sort of terrible accident, and you break both of your legs, and you're unable to work and things like that. It's like, okay, well, so you don't have any friends or family who can help you out. Then it would go up, at least in older America, usually to something along the lines of a church, your parish, your fellow parishioners, or the church would help bring people together. And again, if the church was not able to help, you would go up to things like the city. The city would help you do things. You would have the counties would help. At the last stop would be states helping, because the idea was that welfare is all fine and good, but that it should be done at the lowest level possible. Lowest level being the lowest level of social group possible, because that's the group that knows best what's going on. Because, for instance, there is the question: Are you say, "Oh, I'm poor and starving," or "I have no money and I'm starving," and you say, "Okay, well, do you have no money and you're starving because you're just down and out, and it's not your fault?" Like, again, the hypothetical man who has both of his legs broken and he can't go into work or anything like that. Is he without money and starving because of no fault of his own? It was an accident, or just the situation has gotten out of hand, not really anyone's fault. Or is it because he's a raving alcoholic and spends all of his money on booze and doesn't go into work? You have to ask those questions, and the idea is that the lowest level, the closest level to the problem, is best able to answer those kinds of questions. And they're also the ones who have the most responsibility. Obviously, we have the idea being we have more of a responsibility to those close to us than to those far away. Um, and you had all sorts of things. You had, like, people weren't living on the streets. They weren't going hungry. You had poorhouses. That was a very common thing in early America. You had poorhouses. They weren't super nice, but people didn't go hungry, and people weren't left to live on the street. They were put in poorhouses, and they were given a bed to sleep in, a roof over their head, and they were sent to work, usually on farms and things like that. And that was a way of getting back on your feet um, if you weren't doing too well. Now, you can say that that's inadequate, or that we don't like it, or that it's unfair, but the point is that it existed. Some form of welfare existed. I'm not saying that you have to approve it or to like it or anything like that, but the idea of pure individualism was never really a thing. There were always people willing to help at various levels, socially, religiously, and even at the governmental level. These things were always around. Additionally, you had mutual aid societies, which were sort of like clubs you could get involved in, Elks Lodge, things like that. And they would help take care of people. They would have doctors that they contracted with to help to care for the members and the members' family, to give them basic healthcare services. They would take collections for people among their group if, say, there was an accident and maybe the primary breadwinner for the family wasn't able to work for a few months, but they need money for food and things like that. Then they would take up collections from their fellow members, and they would help them out. And so that was a real thing. All sorts of welfare and things like that existed. It was just at a different level, and so it was much less visible. We didn't have there because, yes, obviously there weren't things like Social Security, there wasn't Medicare, there wasn't Medicaid, there wasn't anything like that at that level with the national government taking care of it. But people were helping each other, even with the government helping each other. Uh, and so this solidarity versus individualism dichotomy is really a false choice. One thing, however, that the book does get right is at the end of that section, it talks about how it does bring up the idea that homogenous, it doesn't quite say it like this, but homogenous societies are higher trust societies. Whenever you have a lot of diversity, it's very, very hard to have a lot of societal trust. People tend naturally not to like others who are different from them in various ways. Not simply skin color, but also religion, country of origin, various ways. And so, the more different the people are, the harder it is to get people on board with helping out others, especially total strangers. Um, and then, so the book does get that right. Uh, the next section, very briefly, we'll talk about the American Dream. Um, the definition that they give for the American Dream is good enough so far as it goes. Yeah, just the general idea that the system is fair, that you can work hard, and so long as work hard, live right, pay your taxes like anyone else, then you have the opportunity to get ahead. Um, and and then people argue, well, we have so many rich people and so many poor people, and the book doesn't go very well into the reasons for a lot of that, and I'm not going to really get into it now because it's a very complicated issue. Uh, but if you have any questions about it, I suppose we can talk about it on Monday, about the views on that. But in general, I'd say it's still pretty true. If it weren't true that people could do this stuff and get ahead, then you wouldn't have thousands of people flocking to this country every year, trying to get in. So still have it might not be as great as it once was as far as opportunity and that sort of thing, but it's certainly better than a lot of the world. The next one, the third for today, the oh gosh, what six overall of the um, seven big ideas. Equality. So equality is obviously something that we talk about a lot in the United States. Um, I just want to go over equality in the founding. I might have said this before in a previous video, but I'll expand on it a little bit more here. So we all know that the Declaration of Independence, uh, we received the words from that, all men are created equal. And there's a lot people make a lot of hay of that. They tend to uh, tend people tend to want to say that that the founders meant something very, very narrow whenever they said all men are created equal. That they somehow meant, whenever they said all men, that was really more of a rhetorical thing. What they really meant was white men who had a sufficient level uh, of property or wealth were somehow equal and everyone else was unequal or inferior, or at least the implication is that they were inferior, uh, that weren't unequal and better. And that simply is not true historically. You can now. That isn't to say that the founders of the United States perfectly lived up to their principles, but the principle was genuine. The They believed that all men, and by the way, in case you want a little uh, lesson in the history of the English language, whenever they say men, that is mankind. In English, in older English, Old English, you had man was a stand-in for human, and you had a prefix that you added to the word man to denote either a male or a female. We still do that for females. We say woman. Wo is the prefix meaning female, man meaning human. So wo man means female human. For men, it was with man. Uh, so with or where, I can't remember exactly what it is. But the point is there was a prefix that was added onto man, and it meant male human being. And that has dropped off in usage, and so now we use the word man for both males as well as just generically, and that was absolutely what was going on there. So it wasn't somehow like only referring to males of the human species; it was referring to both men and women, and it was also referring to non-whites. It wasn't exclusive to not to whites. Now then you say, well, weren't women and non-whites, particularly in the American context, black slaves, weren't they treated unequally? And you say, well, yes, they were. But again, that's there's an answer to that, to the why. The first is that in the case of women, they had certain political rights, but the very basic political right that they didn't have was voting. They had plenty of other political rights. I mean, they could associate with whom they wanted, and they could travel, and they had rights to life and property. Women were not property. A man could not indiscriminately kill a woman, and it wasn't like breaking a shovel or something like that. Assault of a woman was just as punished as assault on men, and or at least just as illegal as that. And so it wasn't that they had no rights; it was that they specifically didn't have the right to vote. And there was a reason for that. You don't necessarily have to agree with the reason, but and you can say it was a bad reason, but it wasn't simply some kind of herp derp we think women are inferior kind of thing. It wasn't just some kind of blatant bigotry and belief in the inferiority of women. It mostly had to do with economic status. And the idea goes that women at the time, and this is true at the time, they were entirely dependent or almost entirely dependent financially on the men in their life. If you were unmarried, that would be your father most usually, but if you're married, it would be your husband. And that meant that you would the belief was that the tendency of women would be to vote however they are told, and that makes a lot of sense because you say if you're entirely dependent on someone else for your well-being, and then you say, well, I have to make a decision on this, then they can say then it's very reasonable to assume that the person who on whom they are dependent could weigh in, and then they would just do whatever they were told. In the same way, slaves were basically the same kind of thing. The idea being, why would you give a slave the right to vote, even though it's a person, he or she is a person? That wouldn't make any sense because their master would just get extra votes. Just like a man in a family would get the vote of his wife and his daughters, because he has control. He has a lot of economic control over them. So a slave owner would get control because he has physical control over his slaves. He would get their votes as well. So he could have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 100 votes, depending on how many slaves he owned. And that was actually one of the arguments. People in the South, especially slave owners in the South, wanted to give slaves votes, and people in the North said, who didn't have slaves, were largely said, no, that's ridiculous because if we gave them the vote, we wouldn't really be giving them the vote. We would be giving them something else, or we would just be giving you more votes. So whenever they said all men were created equal, they really did mean it. And now you can say, okay, well, they didn't hold up to those principles because women didn't get the right to vote for a very long time, for more than 100 years, and you had slavery until after the Civil War. And I would say yes, but no one lives up to their principles perfectly. And as far as slavery, at least, is concerned, well, first of all, women had a whole lot more rights, a whole lot more protection to the law in America than they did in most parts of the world at the time. So we were pretty good as far as that goes. Not giving the right to vote is one thing, but they weren't they weren't treated like property. You couldn't just indiscriminately beat your wife. That was illegal. People were punished for that sort of thing. Now, as far as slavery goes, yes, slavery did continue to exist for nearly 100 years after the founding, but you also had a period of unprecedented emancipation. And I believe I mentioned this in the previous video. Emancipation like the world had never seen before. Half of the country got rid of slavery. Before the founding, every state or every colony which would become a state had slavery was legal in those states. After 50 years or so after the founding, it was illegal in half of them. They made it illegal for slavery to expand into the territories. In the Northwest Territory, slavery could not expand there. The territory that became states like Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, things of that sort. Slavery was prohibited from being legal in those territories. So there was a very, very big emancipation movement. And so they were very much trying to live up to their principles, and they understood. And you can say, well, maybe the gradual elimination of slavery was the wrong way of going about it. Maybe they should have just, immediately done the whole thing, freed all of them right there. That's a question of tactics. That's a question of how of the particular way you're handling a situation. But it isn't a disagreement of principle, because they did think that it was wrong. Now, eventually there became arguments for why it was right, but that was a later development. That was a local development in the South, and it has a long, complicated history of how slavery became even more deeply entwined in Southern life in the United States, and it's a very long and complicated question. But the point was that whenever they talked about equality, they really meant it. They meant men, they meant women, they meant whites, they meant non-whites. Now, whenever we get into equality now, what we generally talk about is well, are two big things we talk about is sort of equality of rights and equality and economic equality. Those tend to be the things that we concentrate the most on. As far as rights are concerned, we're concerned with things like civil rights, especially for non-whites. The idea being that discrimination against blacks or against uh, Hispanics, various things like that. Um, and and also economic equality. We talk about constantly about how certain people are kept down by the system. We have all sorts of opinions and beliefs on that. Your book mentions about how economic disparity is growing in this country, or has been growing for a long time, and about how when Alexis de Tocqueville visited the country, one of the things that he thought was so great was that there wasn't all this economic inequality. Well, yeah, the answer to that is that there weren't very many rich people. As soon as America started getting a lot of wealth in the Industrial Revolution, you had economic inequality come up. We were only economically equal as a country, with most people being somewhere around middle class or lower middle class. Whenever that was all the money we had, we just didn't have a whole lot of money. We didn't have the kind of money that could support super rich people. Not until after the Industrial Revolution, at least. So toward the end of the 19th century. Um, and a big part of economic equality is we talk about sort of two competing things: opportunity versus outcome. We say that you either have equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. Uh, Equality of opportunity basically means the playing field is evil. We don't discriminate so no one gets any special advantages. No one gets any. There's no blocks on anyone. Uh, so everyone has sort of equal playing field. We all start off, at least in a legal capacity, with the same deck of cards. Now, obviously, there are going to be people who have a head start, and maybe they come from a wealthy family, and so they have more capital built up, or maybe and various things. And so there's always going to there's some kind of inequality in there. But at least as far as legal things are concerned, we don't say only whites are allowed to have this kind of business, and only blacks are allowed to build buildings here for businesses like that. We don't say those sorts of things. And so in that sense, we have equality of opportunity at some level. And then equality of outcome being a bit obvious, the opposite, or at some level the opposite of that. The idea that um, if everyone is equal, then the outcome should be similar. If everyone is equal, then the outcomes should be similar. And if the outcome is not similar, then that must mean that somewhere along the line injustice was done. And so what we need to do is we need to basically change the outcome in order to get where we want to go, or change the conditions so that the outcome then becomes equal, which sometimes means giving certain people advantages. Now, your book says that we focus on opportunity and not outcome, or equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. I think this is total bunk. Because we're always talking about how people have different economic outcomes, and about how that must be the result of discrimination of some kind. And so I don't think at all that we're overly concerned with equality of opportunity. The most obvious example of this is affirmative action. Affirmative action is a policy that we've had for quite a while. And the entire idea of that is not equality of opportunity. It's the idea is equality of outcome, that certain people, for whatever reason, in pre-1960s, their outcomes weren't the same. And therefore, there must have been some kind of discrimination in the system that existed beforehand. And so we're going to give them a special sort of head start or heads up or advantage that they wouldn't otherwise have, in order to try to make the outcome equal. And that's a very big policy. It affects schooling, it affects jobs, it affects all sorts of things. And so I think that that's really what we're much more um, uh, were much more focused on. Uh, and I think the book underplays that a bit. The final of these seven big ideas is religion. Now, religion plays a lot of obvious roles in society. If for most people informs, or at least gives them their basic belief structure about what's right and wrong or what's most important in life. And so that's obviously going to have an impact on people's politics. That's going to have an impact on what you think is appropriate or what isn't. Um, certain more conservative Christian denominations are going to have issues with alcohol, and by extension drug use and things like that. Whereas some are a bit more open to those different things, and so that's going to have an impact on what they think is appropriate for things like when and where can alcohol be sold. Um, and various other things. That's just a kind of easy example. Now, the uh, the important thing to think about is, and the book kind of does you a disservice here, and I believe, in not really talking about it. Though there will probably there's a later section on it where it gets into it a bit, but I think it's important to cover here now. And that's the idea of the separation of church and state, and religious tolerance generally. Now, the general thrust of things is that people want to, or not, I say people, there are a large number of people who are very vocal about the idea that they want religion out of politics. They want religion to be somehow excluded from politics, that everything needs to be a kind of reasoned debate. And that's a standard that's really only come about, at least in the United States and in most of the West, in the past 50 years or so. Again, after the sort of post 1960s shift in political thought, because before then, everyone said, "Look, of course you can bring your religion into politics," and they didn't think that the Constitution, in any way, shape, or form, prohibited that. Now, and now let me explain the theory about what they meant in the founding, and this is true for most of American history. What they thought about religious tolerance and what the content of religious tolerance was. The first thing is that there are two. You're talking about two different bodies. There's government and there's the church. And I'll just say, like, the church being a kind of general stand-in for religion, um, whatever your religious congregation is. And the end of government is to protect our rights, or to make us better if you're a progressive, to uplift us, um, and things like that. Whereas the end of a church, or the end of a religion, is not to make us safer and happier and better in this life. It's salvation. That's every, or at least every mainstream monotheistic religion makes a claim about salvation. And so it's fundamentally, or a government is fundamentally oriented toward this life, the ends in this life. Religion being fundamentally oriented toward the goods of the next life, in their own understanding. Um, and so, because of that, you have different ends, uh, and so they're fundamentally talking about different things. The point where this comes into contention is, you say, okay, well, what about people who are involved in government? This is what about magistrates? Magistrate just generally meaning government official. It could be an elected official. It could be like a congressman. It could be an appointed official, someone who's hired, like a secretary of state, or even a police officer, anyone who's appointed by government, or anyone who's elected. So a magistrate, someone who in some way holds the reins of governmental power. Now, the older understanding was that anyone could have opinions about their religion. Anyone could openly be in favor of it or against it. The distinction was that if you had access to government coercive authority, to government power, then you could not use that coercive power to affect people's beliefs on religion. So everyone's allowed to have their opinion. Everyone was allowed to argue. Everyone was allowed to make arguments to try to be persuasive, but no one was allowed to use force. And so, for instance, you could have you could early Congresses printed Bibles and would distribute them in territories, and they thought it was perfectly fine. It's like, look, because why? They weren't forcing anyone to adopt this or that particular sect of Christianity, this or that particular denomination, but they were just in general saying this is a good idea. Um, a magistrate, anyone who has access to government authority, could make an argument that this religion or that religion is better, or that religion requires, or that their religion or all religions require this or that sort of action. But they could not then, if say it's the mayor of your city, they could not then say, I believe that, let's say, the Roman Catholic Church is the one true church. And they could say that, and they could say, and here's an argument for why, and this is why I think it, and so on and so forth, and this affects my policies in this way, and I'll vote this way, or I'll do these certain things. But they can't say, and so since I'm the mayor, I'm in charge of the police. I'm going to tell the police that if you don't go to mass on Sundays, they are to break into your house and round you up and take you to mass, and if you refuse, then we'll throw you in jail. Or if we find out that you're going to a different non-Catholic church, that we're going to round you up and throw you in jail unless you repent and become Catholic. The mayor couldn't do that. He could not use his force, the force allowed him by his office, to force religious belief on people. And that was the idea of the separation of church and state, was that a church, a religion, could not hijack the reins of power from a state, from the state. So that was the idea of the separation. It wasn't that you couldn't, I don't know, have a prayer before a football game, or that you couldn't talk about religion in Congress or things like that, because people did that all the time and they thought it was perfectly acceptable. What wasn't acceptable was that if you went off and abused your authority and tried to say, oh, we're going to make you believe, or at least act as if you believe a certain thing. Now, on top of that, there were certain beliefs that were forbidden, and the idea was because you live in a certain society, there are certain kinds of religious beliefs or religious practices that need to be forgiven, or not forgiven, forbidden rather. For the sake of your society, your civilization in which you live, because the beliefs could be anathema to your civilization. The first of those is any doctrine that's adverse or contrary to human society. Basically, anything that says that you would basically break a law. So, for instance, it's against the law to beat people up. That's assault and battery. If your religion said every third Tuesday of the month, every practitioner of this religion must go and beat up a random stranger. Just go find someone on the street and beat them up. A government does not have to tolerate that sort of religious belief, because you can say, no, it's against the law. So anything that's against the law for someone is against the law for everyone, and it doesn't matter if your religion wants you to break the law. You can't do it; it's still against the law. If your religion, let's say you want to, I don't know, you want to revitalize ancient Aztec human sacrifice, something like that, they would say, no, can't do. That's murder. And so those kinds of beliefs don't have to be tolerated. Another thing that can be forbidden is anything that gives special prerogatives to certain religious groups. Say you have you have a state. Let's say we endorse Episcopalianism or something like that, and you say, well, Episcopalians get special interest rates from the government, and Episcopalians get We have beliefs that we are allowed to do certain things and that everyone else can't do anything, aren't allowed to do anything about it. Maybe we're the only ones who are allowed to own property or something like that. That's also a belief that doesn't have to be tolerated because you're harming other people's rights whenever you do that. A third thing that was that people didn't think that government didn't have to tolerate under older ideas of religious freedom and religious tolerance uh, was that you didn't have to tolerate anyone whose religion made them beholden to someone outside of our body politic. Traditionally, this meant Catholics. The idea was Catholics were always kind of leery, and I say that as a Catholic myself. There was always kind of a question about them because whenever push came to shove, the question was, will you side with your fellow citizens or will you side with the Pope? Will you do what the Pope wants you to do, or will you do what's required of you by our country? And so that was a question, and not a crazy one, especially in the 1800s. It's not a crazy question. It's a bit crazier now, but it's it's a bit less of a reality now. But back then, that was a legitimate question. Um, and so anything that holds you that makes you beholden, because you can't have because the idea was that government didn't have to tolerate split loyalties like that. Um, that if your religion required you to serve another master, required you to give your first loyalty to someone else, whether that was another country or an individual living in another country who wasn't part of this country, government didn't have to tolerate that. They didn't have to tolerate that because it's effectively, at some level, a treasonous attitude. That your true loyalty is to someone else, not your own, or not your fellow countrymen. And the final thing that was allowed to be forbidden generally was atheism. The general idea behind this was a belief in God was usually the backing for things like keeping oaths, and you're talking about a much more religious society. You can disagree with it, but that was the last thing that they thought you could basically you could forbid, and while at the same time maintaining your commitment to religious tolerance. So those were the seven big ideas covered in your book. The last section of this chapter is titled "How Do Ideas Affect Politics?" And your book wants to talk about it as a sort of culture versus institutions question, American culture versus American political institutions. I don't think that that's a good way of putting it, because ideas impact both of them. They impact kind of common culture, and they impact the people who make up these institutions, and also how the institutions comport themselves. I think that the better way of looking at it is a sort of country court distinction. And whenever I say country and court, I mean people who are elites in government power, and that doesn't necessarily mean that includes, but not necessarily limited to, people who are elected in government, because you can have uh, your court interest, a court like a royal court. The idea is you have the people who actually hold normal governmental power, your congressmen, things like that, senators, the president, justices on the Supreme Court, all these sorts of people are kind of this political elite. And then you also have big financiers, lobbyists, bankers, all sorts of people who through money or through long established tradition also have a seat at the table. And also people who are like bureaucrats, people who are hired for a job but never voted on. These people also, walk the halls of power and hold the ear of the powerful. So they tend to have an interest or opinions about things that is largely distinct from what normal Americans, and so that's more the country party. They have there's a distinction between what they want and what the elites want. And there are three basic things, or three basic um, uh, three basic points of policy that I can bring forward to prove that. Um, and whenever I bring up these points of policy, I'm not offering any opinion one way or the other. I'm just pointing out various studies or surveys, polling done on the issues. So, for instance, anytime anytime we talk about NAFTA trade deals, um, they tend to be pretty unpopular with most Americans. They tend to poll very, very poorly. Somewhere along the lines of two-thirds people think that NAFTA is kind of a raw deal for the U.S., whereas a third of the people think it's fine. But political elites tend to like it just fine, and the approval of NAFTA amongst political elites, people, members of Congress, and things like that, they tend to be much, much, much more in favor of it. And so you don't get a lot uh, of um, of support from the political end, even if normal people, at least on average, aren't as fond of it, aren't as much in support of it. Same-sex marriage is something that every time it goes up for a vote, it's voted down. People say they don't want it. Even in California, which is considered one of the most left-leaning states, and rightly so, one of the most left-leaning states in the country. Whenever it was put up for a vote, the citizens of California said they didn't want it. You can think that that's wrong or right. The point is that whenever it was voted on, they didn't want it. But political elites tend to be massively, massively in favor of it. Again, on average, whenever you poll them, and so it went to the courts, and the courts decided that it was going to uphold same-sex marriage, even if whenever it was put for a vote, the people didn't want it. Um, and the most recent one being the presence of Confederate statues. Pretty much every politician in most parts of the country have come out in favor against Confederates, or come not in favor of, but in favor of the removal of Confederate statues against their presence. But whenever people are surveyed, about two-thirds of Americans want the Confederate statues to stay. They say that they're part of our history. And even and even whenever you divide things along a racial line, there isn't African Americans are a little bit in favor of taking them down, but it's not some vast majority. It's not like 90 to 10%. 44% of African Americans in this country want to keep them too. And so it's not some kind of slam dunk issue. It's like, oh yes, whenever we survey the people, everyone 100% or even 90 or 70% are in favor of removing them. Most people don't want them removed. You have a very, very vocal minority of people who want them removed. And you have politicians who, for the most part, also agree with their removal. And so the point is that ideas about justice affect all of these things. Ideas about NAFTA, there's an idea of justice. One of the reasons why it's unpopular with Americans is that they view it as a bad deal for American workers. Whereas the people who are in favor of it think that they have an idea that it's good for people in the aggregate, that it makes us wealthier in the aggregate, and that's what's good. For same-sex marriage, there are a variety of reasons that people might be for it or against it, but the fact of the matter is that Americans on average are not in favor of it. But the political establishment, the elites, the court party, thinks that it's a matter of justice that they be allowed to marry, and you can go either way on the issue. But the point is that that the idea affects both of them. It's not purely a culture versus institutions thing. But that it's the distinction, at least in politics, that we see is more a distinction between the country and the court. And again, same thing with Confederate statues, as I explained before. So that is the first chapter of your textbook, ideas, the ideas that shape American politics. For next week, please make sure that you read the second chapter of the textbook. The syllabus is up online. And you'll notice that I ask you to read the entire chapter by Monday, and we'll spend all three classes next week going over through the second chapter. If you are, again, if you're still looking to get a textbook, the last that I heard is that there should be more available tomorrow at the college bookstore. If there aren't, don't sweat it. I will be able to give you a good rundown just in lectures. It won't be the end of the world if you don't have it on Monday or something like that. But if you can get it, if you don't have it and you can get there on Thursday or Friday to try to buy a copy, please do. And so that we can go ahead and get moving forward with the semester without having to worry about that anymore. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week.